4 arrows, what I would love for you to talk to us a little about first is how you have gotten here to this moment in time, just a little bit of introduction of how you came to this point in time and studying what you study, and then we'll let you understand just quickly who your audience is.
Okay, I'm petu washte, chante washte, not petu. I'm just saying I want to greet everybody with a warm handshake from my heart, and I do want us to lead with our heart tonight, even though there'll be a lot of academic kind of talk and head thinking. Let's tune into our intuition on this, because the DNA of all of us will resonate with the original nature-based worldview that we had and that guided us for 99% of human history. How I got interested in this, I was not raised indigenous. My great grandmother was an adopted escapee from the Trail of Tears, a young girl who was adopted by the Crawford family. And so that was my great grandmother. But my mother and her sisters, downplayed, their dad my grandfather had committed suicide. And so, if anything, my understanding of Indians was either negative or, watching the Cowboys and Indians on television. In my 40s, I kind of specialized after the Marine Corps in Vietnam in getting the chip off my shoulder by doing whitewater kayaking. And I attempted to be with a buddy of mine named Dave Carr. We were firefighters at the time. The first to kayak down the Rio Urique River in central Mexico. And long story short, the entire river disappeared into an underground hole that took me in it. And I had a near-death experience. The video, The Shaman's Message, is available to watch on YouTube. That tells the whole story. And of course, I have a book called Primal Awareness that tells the story. But the Tarahumara, or the Raramuri Cimarron Indian people, rescued us out of this 8,000-foot deep canyon. And a few years later, I was in Marin County, California, when I read about how the Raramuris were being murdered by the Fontes drug cartel. And I told my wife, B, I have to go. They saved my life. I got to go down and see what I can do to tell their story. Because at that time I was already doing some writing. And so when I came back from the 2 trips, the original one and the second one, over a span of 15 years, I was so amazed by the culture of the Raramuri, who still lived in the traditional ways. I mean, it was a 3-day hike just to get to their where they lived, that I wanted to learn more about this way of living and these beliefs and this humor and this sense of oneness with the everything that was around them. So I went to Boise State University and got my second doctorate with a cognate in Indigenous worldview. The first job I got right out of the college was to reorganize a unaccredited education program at Oglala Lakota College on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and so that's my story.
Fabulous. Oh, it's amazing. So Danny, can we see who our audience is tonight? Wow. Oh my gosh. So we have, a lot of people, almost everyone concerned about our future. So we have some people who are very familiar, quite a few who have heard of it, but aren't well-versed, and someone who doesn't know anything about it. So what are some of your biggest concerns? Deep divides in people, fragmentation of society, how we enable this topic for our own study and our own children, unity, pollution, sustainability, equity, dominant worldviews destroying us, human treatment of one another, environment and social justice, climate change, people changing their values and way of being in relationship with nature and each other. Wow, so many. Resistance to and fear about addressing issues of like colonization, rampant individualism and greed built in public institutions. Fabulous. Okay, so there you go. So can we start this conversation with actually this question about why is worldview reflection important?
Absolutely. I think we'll quote probably the guy who's considered to be the expert scholar nowadays, Coco Rivera is his name, an amazing writer, and he's really put this worldview idea on the map. And what he says is it's the most important construct that the typical psychologist has never heard of. And then he says the same thing about it, that the typical educator, the typical philosopher has never heard of. Originally, Weltanschauung, a German concept, it was in the 1830s talked about by German philosophers as a theory of the world, if you will. A definition that is relatively accepted is that it's the foundational assumption that we have about our place in the cosmos. So it's all encompassing as a foundation. It influences all of our behaviors. Sometimes we're conscious of it, sometimes we're not so conscious of it. But in any case, we usually take the ideas, the precepts for granted uncritically as being the way things are in a worldview. And so they guide our thinking. Now, my perspective on it is a little different than at this point in time, the academy and the philosophers are thinking about worldview. They see a culture as a worldview, a religion. And in fact, if you put in worldview, most what you'll come up is different religions, each claiming to be a different worldview, right? So cultures, religions, ideologies, philosophies, all of these things are still, the word worldview is used to refer to, but that waters down this basic, deep idea that Coco Rivera and even the Weltanschauung German philosophers had, that this is a foundational understanding of the world. And so in the 1940s and 50s, the father of social anthropology named Robert Redfield, he's the one that put the study of worldview into anthropology and sociology. And he came to the conclusion, just to be real brief, that all worldviews are only about three things: humans, nature, and supernatural events and ideas, and how people understand those three things. And using that as the basis for his work at the University of Chicago, him and his team came up with, there's only three worldviews. And this will shock Susie to hear three. I thought there were only two, right? Well, in the 40s, he said there were three, that the Eastern worldview had not yet been overtaken by the Western dominant worldview that we have today. By the time he retired, he said that those three were down to two. And one he called the mythological one, which is what we're referring to as the indigenous worldview. And the other one he called the civilized one, which is what we're referring to as the dominant one, right? Now, what's interesting is whether you buy that into this idea that there are only two principal worldviews or not, and it's arguable among scholars. What I found over the past 2 decades, and I've been doing this work for maybe 3 or 4, is that when you see people that are really good scholars talking about worldview, they wind up only talking about the kinds of things that relate to indigenous versus are opposed to the dominant. And in fact, I looked at a TED talk today that I sent my class. Susie, you'll probably get it, in which a guy who made $1 billion last year, he's a billionaire, who said capitalism is wrongheaded because it doesn't understand that human beings are cooperative, have an intuitive morality, and are into reciprocity as a basic nature. But then he went on to talk about markets and stuff like that. And I thought, oh my gosh, he could be a salesperson for talking about how we get to remembering that we all are, these things. And yet that idea is not in the common domain. And that's what we're going to try to do today, is help you all begin to understand how we can begin to transform some assumptions that we have about the world, about whether we're superior to an ant or not, right? And what difference that can make in facing the problems that we are all facing now.
So in thinking about what we now consider are 2, not 3 indigenous worldviews for arrows, what are essential differences, and how does the indigenous worldview differ from what guides most cultures today?
Well, let me just do a couple of quotes that I've got on my cheat sheet here. Leanne Simpson is an indigenous scholar who she outlined 7 ideas about worldviews. And I'll just go through them real quickly. One is that knowledge is holistic. That means knowledge isn't knowledge if it's not about social, mental, emotional, physical, the whole ball game, right? It's also cyclic. It goes through cycles and depends on relationships and connections at a particular time to both living and non-living beings. Okay, and see how different that is already.
Right.
The idea that there are many truths and the truth is multifaceted. Now, this is not relativism, but it's the complexity of truths and how they depend upon individual experiences. That everything is alive and is equal. And this is like all creatures, and this includes rocks, this includes trees, this includes water, that they have a soul, a spirit, that the land is sacred, and that because of that, right? And that relationships between people and the spiritual world is vital, with, if anything, humans perhaps being the least important. Okay, so that's one scholar's perspective, who's an indigenous scholar. McKinsey and Morissette, who've written about this, they say that the basic way to understand it is that in the indigenous worldview, all things exist according to the principles of survival. That's the primary idea. And then all those things that I just read from Jean were the ways to be doing that survival. The act of survival pulses with that natural energy and cycles of the earth, that the energy is part of a grand design that is mysterious, that everybody has a role, and every life form has a role to perform to ensure balance and harmony and the overall well-being of life. Think about how our world would be different if we had that attitude, that all things are an extension of this laws of nature, if you will, right? And that we all flow from that same source, as mysterious as it may be. And Susie, at some point in time, you can show the Worldview Chart that was in my book, The Red Road, linking diversity and inclusion initiatives to indigenous worldview. And on it, we have 40, unless you think this is a good time to do it now, I can share mine.
Sure, why don't you go ahead?
Just so that you can have a real quick.
Absolutely.
You got to.
That could be helpful.
Yeah, you've got to able my sharing, but you able my sharing so I can.
You can do it now, yeah.
Okay, good. So let's go to the Worldview Charts and open one of these guys up. And so y'all can see that on the left side, we have ideas, precepts, if we will, that are generally behind our institutions, our governments, our educational institutions, our social media, our media of all sorts, which now most are corporate controlled, that this is how we were raised for the most part. If we were raised in outside of a traditional indigenous culture, this is also how most indigenous people, I would say 60 to 70% of American Indians are on the left side of this chart, who have lost the ways owing to hegemony and oppression and the things that we know that happen with boarding schools, right? Kill the save the man, kill the Indian, right? So now, are there people that have beliefs on the right side who are not in an indigenous traditional culture? Absolutely. Like I say, those things are all in our DNA, just like this billionaire guy said on TED, right? Although he only mentioned 3, which was the problem, because these things are all interconnected. But generally speaking, when we look at this chart, we try to look at it contextually. We try to look at it as a continuum and say, well, are there times when focusing on, let's say, number 4, focusing on self and personal gain? Are there times when that makes sense? Well, sure there are, right? Is there time when I should be more head than heart? Yeah, there are. Is there times when I should use competition to feel superior as opposed to just, nah, probably not. But how do we deal with that to bring it into balance, right? So this is, as we'll talk about later, this is not a rigid binary. This is a tool that can give us the option to say, well, wait a minute, I see the problem that we're facing, like whether it be COVID-19 or violence or inequality or whatever it is. Wait a minute, what combinations of things on the right side of the chart could prevent that? What kinds of things on the left side of the chart are causal, are contributing to? And how can we work to reshape this worldview that was based on living in nature and surviving in nature and keeping the water and air clean, right? And keeping all the species that do things that contribute to everybody's life, right? And how do we use that multi, we're looking at 1.5 million years if we go back to the first tool making Homo sapiens. How do we use with this that has been well researched? This comes from a lot of research on the few existing cultures. This comes from the largest study ever done, the United Nations Biodiversity Report in 2019. This comes from hundreds and hundreds of anthropologists at the Yale Archives. This comes from first contact. Even Columbus said when he first saw the Indians that he came upon that he had never seen people so generous, right? So how do we begin to move into these things? Doesn't in some ways seems very difficult, and in other ways, the more my students have been working on it, the more they tell me how it's changing their lives, the more simple it is. But it's a big project, and the decolonizing of education and decolonizing of our mind movement, I think, has a long way to go to even understand itself. So you'll be leaving up or turn these off.
And Troy asked if everyone will get a copy, and yes, we will send a copy, Troy, in the write-up that will come to you in the next few days. So we will definitely do that, and the people that you have spoken about will do that. But so here is a question about that for us. Many people talk about this kind of duality, and is it a dangerous? Is comparing worldviews a dangerous binary?
Well, it's really interesting that you say that, because can I announce to everybody who you got for your external advisor?
Yes.
Yeah. So Hillary Webb, in fact, I have her book right here, right? She is an amazing author, a professor, and she wrote a book called Yan-Antan and Mas-Intan in the Andean World, Complementary Duality in modern Peru, where she talks about the indigenous worldview precept that essentially says that all of the binaries, all of the of nature can be looked at and is looked at by human beings in its polarities. There's up, there's down, there's in, there's out, there's good, there's bad, there's all of these kinds of ideas, right? Well, ironically, this question arises from people who are enmeshed in the dominant worldview, which is considered to be a binary worldview. It's all the Abrahamic religions. Are you either going to go to heaven or you're going to go to hell? You either believe this or you believe this, right? The whole idea of education is based on who's going to win, who's going to lose. And so when scholars who understand the dangers of this kind of binary and how they have created 1% of the people in the world controlling half of the wealth, etc., they begin to go, whoa, binaries are bad things. Well, you can't say a binary is a bad thing, because the binary is just saying it's dark out or it's light out, right? The qualitative binaries are when you say one is better than the other. Well, we are saying, and I am saying, that in many ways we're going to find that it's better not to be human-centered. It's better to be understanding that we are equal in our minds and in our ways of having behaviors and consciousness as animals. Definitely, this is also a better than in many aspects. But even Hillary, who's just endorsed Dorcia Narvaez, is in my book. I don't know if I have here, I've got a quote from her. This is for a book that Dorcia Narvaez from the University of Notre Dame, who is an expert on child development, has specialized to show that indigenous child rearing produces much healthier adults outside of the boarding school phenomenon, and then our dominant worldview. Well, her and I have written a book in which we have quotations of indigenous people about the worldview precepts, and this is what Dr. Webb wrote. She said, "This is a glorious prism of voices calling out to us to imagine a more inclusive and sustainable way of being. I ache for the kind of world that is evoked from the worldview that is put forth in these pages." So this is someone who really understands non-rigid duality and understands the idea of complementary duality, which means as we sit down and look at this worldview chart, we begin to say, okay, what can we do to bring this problem of inequality or looking down on women, which we know is in our Constitution, it's in our religions, it's in our corporate settings. I mean, who doesn't know that women have a lower place in a situation of Western dominant worldview, right? So we look at that and we say, well, how do we know that that's not a good thing, especially since the research shows that there are fewer incompetent women leaders than there are incompetent men leaders. There's actually research on that. But so then we look at, okay, well, how do we bring this into balance? How do we bring the power of men into a balance with how life is better for survival? Because it's the patriarchy problem. We don't see too many female drive-by shooters or snipers or people going in and shooting up schools, right? It's men, right? So they're out. We have to be able to say that there's a balance problem. So it's not a rigid binary. It is a thoughtful way to understand how we are meant to be in the world. And what better way than people who have survived for over 1 million years, up until 9,000 years ago, who created in all their great diversity of stories and ways, which are based on their unique geography. All their languages, which we're losing rapidly, are based on the wisdom of language. How can we not look at that as a blueprint for where we have to go? And of course, there are people there are some of the greatest thinkers in the world who are saying that, right? I mean, the list of people who are endorsing my books, for example, looks like a who's who of some of the greatest thinkers in the world, from Noam Chomsky, John Pilger, Greg Cahetti, Vine Deloria, Sam Keen. I mean, the list just goes on and on. The sixth man to walk on the moon, Edgar Mitchell, when he was up looking down on Earth, had an epiphany. And when he came back, he quit NASA and established the Institute of Noetic Sciences, one of the most respected science laboratories in the world. And he said, this is maybe 15 years ago, only a handful of visionaries understand that the solutions to our world crises rest in our original indigenous wisdom. And so, I think if we can get beyond the chosen people or group idea or right. chosen religion and look at this is not about a particular, this is not a race. This is a way of understanding the world that all of our ancestors who lived according to nature, right? And then we did something that got us into some very creative things. And those aren't necessarily bad, because inventions and creativity was always done. We can look back at gardens that are tens of thousands of years old and ways of creating new plants and ways of doing things. So it's just about how do we do the new technologies in a way that honors the things on the right side of that thing, which would mean, maybe we're not going to do that. Or maybe we're going to do that and it's going to cost a little more money to keep from polluting the river that's behind us. Or maybe, so I guess, that's kind of my best off the top of my head way of countering my colleagues, my well-intended colleagues who say, I'm not going to look at this because this is a either or binary, right? It's much more complex than that. Right. Worldview is much more complex.
So I'm really, it's kind of interesting and difficult to be talking about such a big subject in such a short amount of time. But I think what we hope, right, is that people start to think a little bit more about this topic. And in that vein, I have a number of questions. So if you don't mind, could I ask you some of the questions from the audience?
I love that.
Great. Okay. So Molly asks, I wonder about the Black culture worldview.
That's a great question. And in fact, it came up, and I see you smiling because this came up in our class the other day, which is we have mostly African-American students. The question that one of the students asked was, well, when you refer to indigenous, does that include indigenous Africa? Oh, most certainly. And in Mobutu, and in fact, some of the most profound ideas of indigenous worldview come from indigenous Africa. I work with, and I sent this off to my students, I work with a group in Nigeria who are wanting to bring back, again, they've lost it too there, right? Depending on who's in administration in the government. But they wanted to go into the classroom and start teaching. And if I looked at their words, did you see, Susie, how similar they were to the Lakota? And so absolutely. And I wrote a piece, a peer-reviewed article for the University of British Columbia a few years back with quite a sensitive title that I'll share with you, because this is gonna be difficult work, no matter how we look at it. I used Thomas Paine, one of the founding fathers, a quote of referring to Christianity as the basis of the United States government as a false doctrine. So the name of the article is False Doctrine, the Influence of Christianity on the Failure of Indigenous Political Will. And in it, I quote Malcolm X, who said that all of the Abrahamic religions, with the wonderful teachings that that their founders had became political and used the black as the representative of badness, of evil, of sin. And he showed, and there's the doctoral thesis that I sent, or a master's thesis, is all about how Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all used it as the politics of the churches, way after the founders, who probably were trying to bring us back to indigeneity with the truth. If you look at Muhammad and you look at Jesus, but this political structure. Slavery at the beginning was big, and slavery, Negro meant slavery, right? And so that correlation has happened, and yet, in more and more indigenous people are becoming members of Islam or Christianity or Judaism, and same thing with the black people. And by looking at the worldview, people can keep their initial faith in the teachings that they feel resonate with them culturally, like the teachings of Jesus, right? And then they can look at other things in the Bible, that disparage women and promote slavery or violence, right? And go, whoa, wait a minute. This must be part of the politics that came from humans who were running the religions, and keeping in mind this fact, that the greatest arsenal of power in the world is fear. If you can get people afraid, that gives you the most power in the world. And one of the most powerful ways to keep people afraid is with the concept of heaven and hell, and getting them to believe that, right? And you'll find in indigenous worldview that rigid binary doesn't exist, right? And so African American people, just like more and more indigenous people, have as much or more reason and are closer than many of us to their indigenous roots. And so to return to that worldview, it would be, super.
Great. Matilde asked, how can we seek in-depth information and knowledge about myriads of views that are outside of Western academia and not accessible to most of the world via internet? What authors do you recommend?
So, aside from my 19 books, if you put in Indigenous Worldview, and you look for the author to be indigenous or highly respected in other ways that you can triangulate that, there's a lot of information on indigenous worldview. What there isn't a lot of information on, and that's going to require you finding a local person if you can, is place-based wisdom and knowledge, what the environmental community calls TEK. All right, traditional ecological knowledge. Now, there's a distinction between traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous worldview. And the only people who can have expertise in the traditional ecological knowledge are people who were raised in that culture, where they were in that place for millennia, where they know the language, because the language teaches about the wisdom of how to live in that environment. They know the traditional ceremonies, because the ceremonies are also important. Now, you go to downtown Chicago or wherever you're at, there's not many people that have that anymore. We're losing that rapidly. Brazil, under Bolsonaro now, they've just passed a federal law that's going to evict Indians off of their land in the Amazon. Not only is that going to hurt our breathing of air, but it's going to wipe out medicines that we use. It's going to wipe up the map with genocide, and the loss of many languages that have the knowledge that has been used, right? So place-based wisdom, try to find someone in your own area that speaks the language, an elder or someone who's learning it. Bring them in, try to learn from them. The worldview are those commonalities between the great diversity of stories and ideas that are place-based, and they are so diverse. But the scholarship shows very, very, very many commonalities. Those we can all embrace, even if we haven't been raised with the language, and we can teach those. And Fool's Crow, their Indian country, I'm going to just say this here, is divided on the idea of anything about worldview, decolonizing, or place-based knowledge being taught in schools by anybody that is not the person who lived in that area and did it, which of course is very, very few, right? But White Standing Buffalo and Fool's Crow and Rick Two Dogs, many respected indigenous people say, no, we understand where that's coming from. We understand the suffering and pain that comes from everything having been stolen. And now you want to protect your spiritual ways. But like Fool's Crow says, anyone who thinks that we should not be giving the medicine away and teaching the medicine doesn't know the medicine, right? Yeah. And so we can't romanticize the indigenous. That's just as faulty as trying to demonize it. And we can't just say, oh, we're in the same boat, we'll go along with this. We've got to truly look at what is the worldview that we all inhabited this earth on before we started destroying life systems and creating inequality. If that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. So Eric asked a really interesting question. Knowing that most people, myself included, don't usually respond well to being told their worldview is wrong, how can we instead get people excited about the potential to shift their attitude from competition to cooperation, from exploitation to relationship, not just in words, but in actions?
That's a beautiful question, and it's crucial to the ability for people to be willing to look at it. It's going to be hard enough, as we learned from the class, for someone to get past just their religion, let alone their entire worldview, right? And Socrates, right? And so if we go at it as the way I said, not as a rebalancing and looking at each of the precepts, not as the world view at large, but say, let's look at indigenous worldview, which is a nature-based worldview, and let's look and see, is surviving in nature better if we have this understanding of the world, or is survival in nature better if we have this understanding, and to what degrees and when, right? And if we look at it in that way and not look at this as right or wrong, look at this as, if you come to a fork in the road and you know that this fork is going to a cliff with a big drop off, and this road is going down to where the drinking water is. You can put a qualitative judgment on that without saying, well, that's wrong and this is right. You can say, this is the better path for now, right? If we want to go skydiving, let's go the other way, right? It's a good jump off, right? So it's really an attitude about not getting into my way or the highway. It's looking at why so many people, that are some of the greatest thinkers in the world, are saying what the 2019 biodiversity report said, that we've got to start looking at worldview, the foundation for what we are doing to the world. And I think staying away from the labels and getting into the dialogue, you write me if you have some ideas of entry points that make that better. I have a number that I do in the classroom that seem to be working. I haven't gotten anybody to get up and walk out yet. But those entry points are difficult. They're in a session that's concentrated as this, it doesn't work so well.
So I'm looking at the time, and I know we are at 45 minutes, but I'm actually wondering, would you be okay staying an extra 15 minutes and we have some more of these questions? Is that okay with you?
Oh, it's fine with me.
Great. Okay. So Joshua asked, do you think the individualism that America is founded upon is in direct opposition to a worldview that accepts we are inseparable from everything else? If so, how do you think we can decrease individualism in the culture?
Actually, individualism is very strong under the indigenous worldview. I would say it's stronger under the indigenous worldview than it is under the dominant worldview. And I know that strikes against the chord that we hear, well, indigenous cultures are collectivist and dominant cultures are individualistic. Here's why I make that claim. Under the dominant worldview, yes, it's about me, it's about self, it's about my making the money, it's about me winning the competition, right? And it's and not concerned so much for the community. So for example, in conflict resolution, it's punishment and revenge, whereas in an indigenous way, it's bringing both parties back into community, right? And so, yeah, that shows sort of that difference between I, individual, and us, collective. But the way indigenous people get to that collective is from becoming a human being themselves, a real human being. And that means walking on that red road with generosity being the highest expression of courage, with recognizing we are not superior to any life form that we see, okay? Those things are an individualistic task. That is great autonomy. Indigenous people are very autonomous. They will listen to elders. They will listen to spiritual medicine people who have certain skills about plants or stars. But there isn't the hierarchy of authority. The highest authority in indigenous worldview for decision-making is on personal individual reflection on lived experience under the umbrella of recognizing we're all related, right? So can you see how the indigenous worldview leads to more individualism? The difference is that individualism is always thinking about what they're going to do with it, with the power, the skills, the autonomy, the learning. And what they're going to do with it isn't for self-aggrandizement. It's not for self-ego. It's not for being wealthier than or winning, right? If you look at indigenous sports, you'll love how so many of the sports, I'll give you one brief story because it's such a great question. At Carlisle, after they took Indians like Jim Thorpe, right, and they put them into the football, the coach went crazy because every game against Annapolis and West Point and all the schools that they played, the indigenous team always tied the other team. Well, they didn't know that they would play as hard as they could, but they only did it so that they could, exercise their skills. But when it came to score, they always made it so the other team got to score. So they were tied games, right? There's other African games where people go and there's teams that go out and get logs and pick up the log and run for 50 miles through the woods. And there's maybe 12 people on one and 7 people on the other. They just go pick up the logs and run, and their logs are different weights. Well, when the team with the most people or the lightest log gets in front, right, one person drops off and go back and help the other, but they're all still using all their endurance and skills, right? So thank you for asking that question. Not a lot of people understand that differential.
Great. Susan asked, how do we share Indigenous worldview without sounding evangelistic?
Well, I think that's very similar to the question about, not coming in and saying your worldview is wrong. I would guess that you're saying that because I am probably sounding pretty darn evangelistic. And in my presentations, I learned many years ago in therapy when I was a psychologist, when my enthusiasm for the patient's change is greater than the patient's, I'm going to lose them. And sometimes I'm too enthusiastic with friends about learning how to surf or whatever, or learning how to ride a horse, right? And you still you still lose them just like you do in clinical. And so, but evangelistic means that if that means that, you know, I want to sell you on my approach, that's wrong-headed. If evangelistic, you know, if you want to define that as because that word always is going to relate to religion. But if you want to take that idea and say, I really want to convince you that there is an ultimate way of changing and transforming the problems facing us on this world, then I would say, you know, that, you know, be as enthusiastic as you can without losing somebody.
Yeah. And Jeff asked, how can non-Native people promote Indigenous knowledge and worldviews without appropriating or essentializing?
That's a really important question. I tell the story about my wife, Bea, and I were playing music. She plays the old-time banjo, I play the old-time piano, and we played for the Navajo Star School, STAR, S-T-A-R, Service to All Relations, on the just off the Navajo reservation, and we lived across the street. And I was ending our jazz, our American jazz. I ended it with a thank you song from the Lakota Inipi ceremony, and sang it. Right away, one of the respected medicine people came up to me and said, "You know better than to take that out of the circle and share that with all these non-Indians here." And I patted him on the shoulder and thanked him for his words and said, "You know, we disagree on this, my brother." Not a minute later, another very respected medicine person came up to me and hugged me and said, "You know, thank you for taking that out of the circle." So this kind of gets back to what I say: white standing buffalo with two dogs, a fool's crow, and a lot of the most highly respected Indigenous peoples in the world, past and present. Fine Deloria Jr., who wrote his last chapter in my University of Texas book before he passed. This is about sharing. Now, it's not about misappropriation. Now, you know, in Sedona, you know, some guy made $18 million a year charging money to do sweat lodges and vision quests, and he killed people in a sweat lodge. It's pretty famous, right? And he's in jail right now for manslaughter, right? But that's not the point. Misappropriation, playing Indian, New Age. You know, I don't put down the New Age, but romanticizing and playing Indian and not working to help Indigenous people, even writing a book without giving all your royalties to an Indigenous cause. There's a lot of ways to misappropriate Indigenous spiritual ways, and they've all been used, right? But if you have a good heart, you know, my spiritual path is not my Irish or Cherokee, it's Lakota, and I have no Lakota blood because I was made a relative of the Lakota. And even the United Nations, they say that Indigenous identity comes from self-identity sanctioned by the members of the First Nation, right? And that's what the adoption is. But all of them bring allies in, and all of them bring allies in. And if an ally shows good heart and wants to learn these things or wants to teach them, you know, and like I say, Indian country is split.
Right.
Say half of them are just still have anger and fear, but the ones that I feel don't have fear, they're saying go for it.
Great. The last question I think we'll go with is by John. What's your view about acknowledging we live on Indigenous land, but we don't do anything about it? We just say it was yours,
Okay.
now it's ours.
Everybody has frozen, so maybe that was the last question.
Oh, can you hear now? Four Arrows, can you hear me now? Four Arrows?
Okay, so everybody,
can you hear me?
Let's give him a couple of seconds.
Okay.
Might have a connection intermittency.
Do you want to have people write their takeaways while we wait?
That's a good idea. All right. So Danny, do you mind putting that in the, so Danny just shared another link. If you could just put in your takeaway, your biggest takeaway from today in the link, that would be great. So could you share your email address? Absolutely. Your email address will, if you registered, if that's how you got here, we have your email address and we will share the notes from tonight. And we will also share resources from Four Arrows and also a link to an amazing 3-minute video that he made for the UN. So with that, unfortunately, we'll wait for a minute about the important takeaways that people have. So I think with that, we will thank everyone so much for being with us here tonight. And hopefully we can convince Four Arrows to come back in the future and to discuss this very important topic. And if you are interested in Startover, we would love to have you back. If you just go to startover.com, we have many amazing speakers. So thank you all very much. And we appreciate your being here.